Hi everybody! This video introduces you to the idea of remixes, which along with literature in general is one of the things that we're focusing on in this class. The first idea that I want to talk about is just the idea of a remix. In this class, we'll be using the word remix as a synonym for adaptation. So we can say remix or we can say adaptation, and we'll be using those words somewhat interchangeably. It refers to a work of literature, art, film, music, or any other media that represents another work. Some examples of this would be film adaptations of books, so like, the film of Harry Potter, for example, musical adaptations of poetry, so a lot of songs, a lot of musical artists write songs and perform songs that are based on poems that other people wrote. Comic books that adapt sort of short stories or novels, or even video game adaptations of movies or video game adaptations of books. Those exist too. And there's a whole other world of different kinds of adaptations and different kinds of remixes. And those are just some examples of the kinds of texts that we mean when we use these words. And one definition that I find especially helpful is a definition that Linda Hutcheon gives in her book that's on adaptations. And she describes an adaptation as repetition, but repetition without replication. So it repeats an idea, it repeats a story, it repeats a set of images or themes, but it repeats it in a way that's slightly different without completely trying to replicate the original. So it adds something to it in some way as well. It represents it, but does it in a sort of a creative and different kind of way. And just to give one example of this is a poem and then a sort of comic based on that poem that we were assigned for last week. So the poem that you were assigned for last week was The Eagle by Lord Alfred Tennyson. And the poem reads, he clasps the crag with crooked hands, close to the sun in lonely lands, ringed with the azure world he stands. The wrinkled sea beneath him crawls, he watches from his mountain walls, and like a thunderbolt he falls. So that's the poem. And then on the right side of the screen, you see a comic that a artist created that's based on that poem. So in the first image, we see the actual sort of talons of the eagle along with the words, he clasped the crag with crooked hands, and those talons are supposed to sort of represent that moment in the poem with him sort of clasping the rocks and the crag. And then the next panel, we see this sort of image of the sun and the eagle sort of standing at the top of a mountain. And then you can see sort of just very, very slowly sort of that dark shadow that's the eagle. And that sort of, at the top of that, we have the words close to the sun and lonely lands. So that's supposed to represent his sort of loneliness and also his closeness to the sun. And then in the next panel, we see the sort of outline of the eagle again. It's just a tiny little dot on, I think that's the world, with the sort of sun behind it. And it says, ringed with the azure world he stands. So it's supposed to sort of bring that image of him being sort of ringed with the light coming from the sky of the world is supposed to bring that image to life. And then the next panel, we see him on this sort of cliff above the water, and with the words, the wrinkled sea beneath him crawls. So it's supposed to sort of represent him being sort of high in the sea and not like below him. And then we have the next panel, we have the sort of same image. We see him sort of tipping towards the ocean, and the caption reads, he watches from his mountain walls. So we sort of see him, this idea of him sort of looking down at it, trying to sort of represent visually that image of him looking down his sort of mountain walls, so looking down that sort of steep cliff of the mountain into the water. And then the last four panels read, and like a thunderbolt he falls. And we have this sort of like almost, if you sort of visually watch it, you can sort of see it sort of represents him tipping off the top and then trying to fly and then toppling into the ocean. So we're trying to sort of visually mimic that fall. So what we have here is we have this attempt by an artist to sort of visually and through images, but then also words, represent the kind of sort of imagery and narrative that Tennyson is capturing in his poem. So it's a repetition of the same images, a repetition of the same words, and a repetition of the same kind of narrative, but it's being done in a different kind of way. Instead of having it with just words and words that rhyme, we also have the addition of images and these panels that sort of try to represent the action of the poem as broken down into a sequence. So, what should we do when we're reading remixes? And how should we approach the remixes? And sometimes when people approach remixes or adaptations, they begin with a question of whether it's faithful to the original. So if you go to see a movie and it's based on a book and you really, really love that book, and one of the things you may be thinking about is, does this sort of faithfully represent the book? Does it capture everything about the book that I loved about the book? And if it doesn't do that, you might be mad because you were going into sort of expecting to have this sort of faithful replication of the book. And that's certainly a valid way to represent adaptations or remixes, but I don't want that to be the focus of this class, or the focus of the kinds of discussions that we're having in this class when we look at remixes or adaptations. So some of the questions that I want us to be thinking about are, first of all, how does the remix develop aspects of the original literary work? This might include images or the tone of the original work, or characters that are within the work, or themes that are within the work. In other words, how does it sort of take and present those things that we as readers identified as being unique features of that literary work? So if you're, watching a movie that's based on a book, you might ask yourself, what aspects of sort of the characters did the movie really sort of capture and represent? What aspects of the sort of plot did it accurately represent? What themes that were present in the book did the movie capture and represent? And how did it do that? What sort of choices did the writers and the producers and the actors make in order to convey those themes or those ideas or those characters to the audience? The second question I would like us to be thinking about is, how does the remix depart or update aspects of the literary work? In other words, how does it maybe depart from the imagery of the literary work, or how does it depart from the tone of a literary work, or how does it change characters or change themes? And what are the choices that they make to cause those changes? And I don't want us to necessarily think of those changes as necessarily bad things, because adaptations and remixes are sort of creative works in their own right. So when someone sits down to make a movie or make a song or make a comic that's based on a literary work, they're bringing something of themselves into it, and they're going through their own creative process. And so that creative process and the evidence of that creative process is going to be present in the remix. And as readers, we can acknowledge that and appreciate that as well. And then finally, I want us to be thinking about how remixes interpret the original literary work. In addition to being creative works, remixes and adaptations are also interpretive works. They represent the creator's understanding of a work, or their understanding of a character, or their understanding of a theme. So I want us to be paying attention to what images or characters or themes or elements that the remix emphasizes, but also potentially what kinds of images or characters or themes or other elements that it downplays. So these are some questions to get us started thinking about remixes. We won't be looking at that many remixes in this poetry unit, but we will be looking at a few, and these are also questions that I want us to continue thinking about when we move on into the fiction unit as well. So hopefully these are places for you to get started, and I hope that you enjoy looking at some of the remixes that we're going to be looking at as a class in this class.